Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The marketing startup in Denver seemed like the perfect escape after college graduation, but 6 months into the job, everything started falling apart. January 2022 found me crying in bathroom stalls during lunch breaks, unable to sleep more than 3 hours a night, and calling in sick twice a week just to avoid facing another spreadsheet. My apartment in Capitol Hill felt like a prison cell. Just me, takeout containers, and the constant weight of knowing my family in Ohio had no idea how badly I was drowning. After my manager pulled me aside to discuss my concerning performance decline, I finally admitted I needed professional help. My company's health insurance covered mental health services, and the HR department specifically recommended Whitmore Behavioral Health Center, this gleaming facility nestled between medical offices and wellness spas in Cherry Creek. The reviews online were stellar, 5 stars across every platform, with testimonials about life-changing treatment programs and revolutionary therapeutic approaches. Dr. Nathaniel Graves became my assigned psychiatrist, and our first appointment felt strange from the moment he walked into the consultation room. He moved with this calculated precision, like every step and gesture had been rehearsed 1,000 times. His appearance was almost artificially perfect: silver hair that caught the light at exact angles, a white coat that seemed immune to wrinkles, and these pale blue eyes that would lock onto mine without blinking for uncomfortably long stretches. He listened to my symptoms while taking notes on a tablet he kept tilted away from my view, occasionally making these soft humming sounds that weren't quite agreement or disagreement, just acknowledgement that words were being spoken. After exactly 45 minutes, he diagnosed me with adjustment disorder with depressed mood, and immediately recommended their intensive outpatient program: 3 sessions weekly, including individual therapy, group meetings, and what he called pioneering mood regulation protocols. He explained that Whitmore was participating in groundbreaking research, using techniques that major universities were still years away from implementing, methods that could rewire negative thought patterns at what he called the neurological substrate level. The first few weeks seemed normal enough: standard talk therapy with a counselor named Janet, who had warm brown eyes and always offered me chamomile tea, group sessions where we shared our struggles with anxiety and depression, and basic mindfulness exercises. But then came the mood regulation protocols, and that's when things started getting weird. They'd take me to this windowless room in the basement, walls painted this specific shade of gray that Dr. Graves insisted was chromatically optimized for neural receptivity, where I'd sit in a reclining chair while they attached sensors to my temples, wrists, and chest. A technician named Bradley, who never made eye contact and always wore these thick rubber gloves, would monitor readings on multiple screens while playing audio tracks through headphones, not music or meditation guides, but these rhythmic pulses mixed with what sounded like reversed speech that I could never quite make out. During these sessions, Dr. Graves would enter periodically to inject something into my IV that he claimed was just saline solution with vitamin B12. But it always made my vision blur at the edges and left this metallic taste that lingered for hours. The other patients in my group therapy started mentioning similar experiences, though we were explicitly forbidden from discussing our individual treatment protocols with each other. They said it could contaminate the therapeutic environment and compromise treatment efficacy. There was Kevin, a former teacher who'd developed these facial tics after his sessions started, constantly touching his left ear like he was trying to adjust an invisible earpiece. Melissa, who'd come in for postpartum depression, began speaking in this flat monotone during group sessions, reciting her feelings like she was reading from a script she'd memorized but didn't understand. And then there was Anthony, probably the most disturbing case, who'd started documenting everything in this notebook he carried everywhere, writing down timestamps and drawing these intricate diagrams that he'd quickly cover whenever staff members walked by. We all noticed the changes in each other, the way our symptoms seemed to be morphing into something different from what we'd come in with, but the fear of being labeled non-compliant or treatment-resistant kept us quiet. Everything escalated during my 6th week at Whitmore, when they introduced what Dr. Graves called cognitive reconstruction sessions. They moved me to a different wing of the building, one that required a special key card and had no signs or room numbers, just colored dots on the doors. Mine was orange with 3 black stripes. The chair in this new room had restraints, which Bradley assured me were just for postural consistency during neural mapping. But once they strapped me in, I couldn't move anything except my eyes. They placed this curved screen inches from my face and began showing me rapid sequences of images. Some were benign, like landscapes or furniture, but others were deeply personal photos I'd never given them. My childhood bedroom, my mother's face at different angles, even screenshots of text conversations from my phone. Between the images, single words would flash too quickly to consciously read, but I'd feel my mouth trying to form sounds that weren't quite words, like my tongue was attempting to speak a language it didn't know. After these sessions, I'd lose chunks of time. Not blackouts exactly, but these gray periods where I'd suddenly find myself in different parts of the building with no memory of walking there. The staff would tell me I'd been participating in activities, even show me sign-in sheets with my signature, but the handwriting looked wrong, too perfect, like someone had practiced copying my style. My roommate called one evening, concerned because I'd apparently had a 20-minute phone conversation with her that I couldn't remember at all. She said I'd spoken normally but kept repeating specific phrases about being grateful for the treatment and how Dr. Graves was helping me understand myself. The worst part was finding notes in my journal that I didn't remember writing, detailed observations about the other patients using clinical terminology I didn't know, rating their compliance levels and susceptibility indices with numerical scores and color-coded categories. My breaking point came when Anthony slipped me a folded paper during group therapy. While Janet was distracted by Melissa having one of her episodes, she'd started laughing and crying simultaneously while reciting multiplication tables. His note was frantic, barely legible. "They're conditioning us. Check your diagnosis. Original paperwork. They changed mine." He'd drawn a crude map to the records room, marked with times when staff rotations left it briefly unguarded. That night, I pretended to have severe insomnia, which wasn't hard since the medications they gave me caused this constant buzzing sensation under my skin, like electrical currents were running through my veins. When the night nurse did her 3 a.m. rounds, I counted exactly 4 minutes after her footsteps faded, then made my way to the administrative wing using Anthony's map, my hospital socks silent on the polished floors. The records room smelled like old paper and disinfectant, file cabinets stretching from floor to ceiling with tiny labels I could barely read in the dim emergency lighting. I found my file in the 3rd cabinet, fingers trembling as I pulled out the thick folder marked with my patient ID number and a red sticker I'd never seen before that said Protocol 7A. The intake form I'd signed clearly stated, "Adjustment disorder with depressed mood," exactly what Dr. Graves had told me, but underneath were additional documents I'd never seen. My diagnosis had been amended 3 times without my knowledge, first to severe treatment-resistant depression with psychotic features, then schizoaffective disorder, and finally, dissociative identity disorder with high suggestibility index. Each change was dated after specific treatment sessions, signed by Dr. Mai, Graves, and 2 other doctors I'd never met, with attached forms authorizing increasingly invasive procedures. The most recent form, dated just 2 days ago, approved something called Phase 3 neural restructuring, and had a box checked for patient consent obtained through therapeutic persuasion. Behind the medical forms, I found something even worse. A research proposal titled Behavioral Modification Through Systematic Diagnostic Escalation, with Whitmore's logo and a pharmaceutical company's name I recognized from the news. Xerogen Corp. Recently investigated for unauthorized drug trials in Eastern Europe. The abstract described using incremental false diagnoses to justify experimental treatments, testing how far patients could be pushed before they either accepted their manufactured conditions or attempted to leave. We were the test subjects, sorted into different protocols based on our initial psychological profiles. My group, Protocol 7A, was designated for maximum cognitive plasticity assessment, essentially seeing how completely they could rewrite our sense of reality. The document included charts showing successful integration rates, where success meant patients who fully accepted their false diagnoses and requested continued treatment even after the study period ended. I photographed everything with my phone, hands shaking so badly that half the pictures came out blurred. But I needed proof because I knew no one would believe this without evidence. As I was putting the files back, I found Anthony's folder with a yellow sticky note on top. Subject terminated from study, excessive awareness, schedule for standard treatment and discharge. The date was tomorrow. I grabbed his file too, along with Kevin's and Melissa's, shoving papers into my pajama pockets until they bulged obviously. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway, the distinctive squeak of Bradley's rubber-soled shoes against the linoleum. I slipped out the other door, the one leading to the stairwell, and ran up 2 flights before ducking into a supply closet that reeked of industrial bleach and something sickly sweet I couldn't identify. Through the door crack, I watched Bradley pass by with Dr. Graves, both of them heading toward the records room, their voices low but urgent. The next morning, I acted completely normal during breakfast, forcing myself to eat the scrambled eggs that tasted like cardboard, while Bradley watched from the corner, his eyes tracking every movement. During group therapy, I participated enthusiastically, even volunteering to share how much the treatment was helping me see my distorted thinking patterns, using the exact phrases Dr. Graves had been feeding us for weeks. Janet seemed pleased, making notes with a slight smile, unaware that I'd uploaded all the photos to 3 different cloud services and emailed them to my sister with instructions to contact a lawyer if I didn't call her by 6 p.m. Anthony wasn't at group therapy. They said he'd been discharged early that morning due to family circumstances, but Kevin whispered that he'd seen security escort Anthony to a van around 4 a.m., still in his hospital gown. After lunch, I told Janet I was feeling overwhelmed and needed to call my mother, something they encouraged as maintaining family connections. Instead, I called a law firm that specialized in medical malpractice from the lobby payphone, speaking quickly while watching Bradley pretend to read a magazine nearby. Within 3 hours, my sister arrived with 2 lawyers and a court order for immediate release and preservation of all medical records. The look on Dr. Graves's face when they served him papers was pure calculated assessment, like he was determining exactly how much I knew and whether it was worth trying to discredit me. They had to release me immediately, but not before Janet pulled me aside to warn that leaving against medical advice would severely impact any future treatment I might need, her warm brown eyes now cold and threatening. The lawyers got me out of there, along with copies of my official records, which mysteriously only showed my original diagnosis and standard treatment notes, nothing about the experimental protocols or the documents I'd photographed. But I had the pictures, the other patients' files, and most importantly, I had Anthony's notebook that he'd hidden in the communal bookshelf, filled with dates, names, and detailed observations of everything they'd done to us. The investigation is still ongoing. Whitmore is still operating, and sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m. with words on the tip of my tongue that I don't recognize, fragments of that reversed speech still buried somewhere in my mind. The tremors in my left hand had gotten worse over the past 6 months, bad enough that I couldn't hold a coffee cup some mornings. My neurologist ran every test imaginable, MRIs, nerve conduction studies, blood panels, and found nothing. Could be psychological, she said, suggesting maybe something from my past was manifesting physically. That's how I ended up driving through upstate New York on a rainy October afternoon, heading toward Riverside Psychiatric Institute, where I'd spent 8 months as a 16-year-old. My parents had me committed after my brother died, said I was having a breakdown, but really I was just an angry, grieving teenager who didn't know how to process losing the only person who understood me. The place had been closed for 5 years, according to Google, but reopened recently as some kind of research facility. Still, they kept old patient records, or so the woman on the phone claimed when I called asking about my files. The building hadn't changed much. Same red brick exterior with those narrow windows covered in wire mesh. Same imposing iron gates that made you feel like a prisoner before you even walked through the doors. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered around like forgotten thoughts. Inside, the lobby had been renovated with modern furniture and fresh white paint, but underneath that new car smell of recent construction, I could detect something else. That institutional cocktail of disinfectant, floor wax, and something medicinal that seemed baked into the walls themselves. The receptionist, a young woman with nervous energy who kept tapping her fingernails on the desk, said Dr. Simmons could see me in 20 minutes. While waiting, I noticed my hand had stopped shaking for the first time in days, like it recognized this place and decided to behave. Dr. Simmons turned out to be a woman in her 50s with prematurely gray hair pulled into a tight bun, and the kind of careful, measured way of speaking that made you wonder what she wasn't saying. She led me through hallways that sparked fragments of memory. The art therapy room where we made clay sculptures that always got thrown away, the cafeteria with its bolted-down tables, the medication window where we lined up like cattle every morning, noon and night. "You were here in 2002, 2003, she said, reading from a tablet as we walked. "Part of the adolescent program under Dr. Harrison's care. Says here you responded well to treatment." I asked what treatment specifically, and she glanced at her screen with this odd expression, like she was reading something that didn't quite make sense. "The notes are sparse, but I can show you your file if you'd like. We're actually in the process of digitizing everything from that era." Her office was in what used to be the isolation wing. I remembered because Jorge got sent there once for 3 days after he refused his medication and tried to flush the pills. The other kids said they could hear him screaming at night, but the staff insisted the rooms were soundproof. Dr. Simmons pulled out a manila folder thick with papers, some yellowed with age, others looking like they'd been photocopied multiple times. As she handed it to me, I noticed several pages had black redaction marks across entire sections. "Patient confidentiality," she explained, but that didn't make sense. It was my own file. The first few pages were standard intake forms, my parents' signatures authorizing treatment, psychiatric evaluations describing me as hostile but manageable. Then I found the medication logs, and my stomach tightened. Alongside the antidepressants I vaguely remembered, there were drug names I'd never heard of. Neurozine 7, Synapticor, something called TX-149 listed only by its code. "What's TX-149?" I asked, pointing to the entry that appeared daily for 3 months straight. "Dirt." Simmons leaned over, adjusting her reading glasses, and I saw her jaw clench slightly. "I'm not familiar with that designation. Probably a trial name for something that's now FDA approved under a different label. This was 20 years ago after all." But her voice had changed, gotten tighter, more formal. She tried to turn the page, but I held it down, scanning the dosage charts. The amounts kept increasing every 2 weeks, and there were handwritten notes in the margins. Subject shows expected neural response and tremor onset week 6 within acceptable parameters. My left hand started shaking again, violent enough that the paper rustled. Dr. Simmons noticed and pulled back slightly. "Mr. Walker, I think perhaps we should..." But I was already flipping through more pages, finding similar notes about other patients. Jorge's name was there, with a note about facial tic development. "Continue protocol." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. I found a page titled Trial Group C, Long-Term Observation Required, with 12 names listed, mine included. Next to each name were codes I didn't understand and a column marked persistent effects that had been completely blacked out. But whoever did the redacting got sloppy on one page. Held up to the light, I could make out partial words through the marker. Neurological, permanent, class action risk. Dr. Simmons stood up, reaching for the folder. "I need to make some calls," she said, her professional composure cracking. "This shouldn't be. These documents should have been." She stopped herself, but I'd already seen enough. I grabbed the folder tighter, and that's when several loose pages fell out from the back. Pages that looked different, like they'd been hidden there. They were carbon copies of consent forms, but not signed by my parents. The signature line showed Dr. Marion Harrison with a check mark in a box labeled Ward of State, Temporary Guardianship. My mind raced trying to process what this meant. My parents had visiting rights, came every Sunday for the first few months until the staff told them I was becoming too agitated by the visits and needed space to heal. But if Dr. Harrison had claimed temporary guardianship, even for specific medical decisions, they would have needed a court order, some kind of legal justification. Unless... I remembered now how they'd kept us in the adolescent wing for those first 72 hours of evaluation. How they said it was standard procedure. How no outside contact was allowed during that period. Enough time to file paperwork, to exploit some loophole. Dr. Simmons was on her phone now, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone, throwing glances my way every few seconds. I photographed as many pages as I could with my phone, my hands shaking so bad that half the pictures came out blurry. Then I saw another familiar name on the trial list, Christopher Valdez. I knew that name. He'd made the news about 5 years back, killed himself after years of battling unexplained neurological problems. His family had blamed PTSD from his teenage years, but now I wondered if they ever knew about Riverside. "Mr. Walker, I'm going to need that folder back, Dr. Simmons said, ending her call. Her tone had shifted from nervous to something harder, more authoritative. "Those documents contain confidential information about other patients. I shouldn't have..." But I was already reading another carbon copy. This one a memo between Dr. Harrison and someone at a pharmaceutical company called ZeroGen Corp. The letterhead was partially visible through the aged paper, and the content discussed preliminary results exceeding expectations and minimal oversight from state regulators. The memo mentioned that the adolescent subjects were ideal candidates because their developing brains showed higher plasticity, and any side effects could be attributed to their underlying conditions. My whole body felt cold, that kind of chill that starts from inside your bones. "Doctor." Simmons moved toward me, but I stepped back, clutching the folder. "How many of us were there?" I asked. "In the trials, how many kids did you people experiment on?" She stopped, her face cycling through expressions like she was trying to find the right mask to wear. "Dr. Harrison's research was approved by the board at the time," she said finally, each word carefully measured. "Different era, different standards. But I assure you, any treatments you received..." I cut her off by holding up the memo about minimal oversight and watched her face go pale. She knew exactly what had happened here. "You need to understand," she said, voice dropping lower. "I only started here 3 years ago. When we reopened, we found boxes of these files in the basement, water-damaged, forgotten. I've been trying to piece together. But Harrison destroyed most of the actual research data before he retired. What you're holding might be the only proof left." The tremor in my hand had spread up my arm now, the muscle spasms visible through my shirt. She noticed and added, "There are others. Former patients who've come back over the past year. Same symptoms, same questions. Most of them can't afford lawyers and without complete documentation." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. We were screwed. I thought about calling the police right there. But what would I report? Experimental drug trials from 2 decades ago with half the evidence destroyed, and the main perpetrator probably living comfortably in retirement. Instead, I asked Dr. Simmons for the names of the other former patients who'd come forward. She hesitated, clearly weighing the ethical implications against whatever guilt she was carrying. "I can't give you names," she said finally. But I can tell you there's a support group that meets Wednesday nights at the community center on Oak Street. They call themselves Survivors of Institutional Abuse. You might find who you're looking for there." She paused, then added quietly, "Bring copies of those documents. They've been trying to build a case for years, but nobody had proof of the drug trials. Harrison was careful, but apparently not careful enough." My phone buzzed with a text from my wife asking if I was okay, and I realized I'd been here for 3 hours. Time had done that strange thing it does during trauma, stretching and compressing simultaneously. Before leaving, I made copies of everything using the printer in Dr. Simmons' office while she stood guard at the door, nervous that someone might walk in. "Security cameras were disabled in this wing for maintenance," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "At least that's what I'll say if anyone asks." As the machine hummed and spat out page after page of evidence, she told me something that made my chest tighten. Dr. Harrison died last year, pancreatic cancer. But his research partner, Dr. James Brennan, he's still alive, lives about 2 hours north near Albany. He might know more about what was in those drugs, maybe even have data about long-term effects. She scribbled an address on a post-it note, her handwriting shaky. "He's in his 80s now, mild dementia according to his daughter who called here once looking for information about her father's work. But on his good days..." She let the sentence hang. I took the copies, the post-it, and left that place with my hand trembling worse than ever. But now I understood why. My body had been remembering what my mind had been forced to forget. That was 6 months ago. The support group led to a lawyer who specializes in institutional abuse cases, and we now have 43 former patients documented with similar neurological issues. Dr. Brennan, on one of his lucid days, admitted to keeping detailed records of the trial hidden in his attic. Records that showed Neurozine 7 and TX149 were experimental neuroleptics designed to create permanent changes in brain chemistry to make patients more manageable long-term. The tremors, the tics, the various neurological problems we all developed were listed as acceptable side effects in exchange for behavioral modification success. Xeragen Corp dissolved in 2008 after a series of unrelated lawsuits, but we tracked down 3 former executives through the lawyer. The case is moving forward, slowly but steadily. Some days my hand shakes so bad I can't write my name, and Jorge, yes, I found him, living in Syracuse with that same facial tic, has seizures now. Christopher Valdez's family joined the lawsuit after we showed them the documents. But we're alive, we're fighting, and we finally have proof that we're not crazy, that what happened to us was real. Dr. Simmons still works at Riverside, now helping other former patients access their records. She calls sometimes to check on me, and last week she said something I'll never forget. The real horror isn't what they did to you. It's that they genuinely thought they were helping. Six years of case files, patient advocacy meetings, and discharge paperwork had made me pretty good at spotting inconsistencies in medical records. At Greenwood Medical Center, where I worked as a social worker, paperwork errors were common enough that most people just shrugged them off. It was March 2023, and I was 34, recently divorced, basically living at the facility because home was just an empty apartment with too much silence. My supervisor used to joke that I knew the patients better than their own doctors did, which was probably true since I spent most of my waking hours reviewing their cases and coordinating their care plans. The facility itself was nothing special, a mid-sized psychiatric and rehabilitation center with about 200 beds, serving mostly Medicare patients and folks on state insurance. That mundane setting makes what I discovered even harder to believe, Mrs. Hoffman changed everything when she showed up at my office on a Wednesday afternoon, her face puffy from crying and her voice breaking every few words. Her son Daniel had been in our psychiatric wing for 2 months, dealing with severe depression after losing his job and his marriage in the same year. The nursing staff had told her the previous week that Daniel was being transferred to Fairmont Hospital for specialized treatment, something about a new therapy program that would better suit his needs. But when she called Fairmont to check on visiting hours, they had no record of Daniel ever arriving. She'd even driven there herself, spent 3 hours arguing with their admissions desk, watching them search every possible variation of his name and birth date in their system. The way her fingers trembled as she showed me the transfer paperwork made my chest tighten, because deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong. I told Mrs. Hoffman I'd make some calls and get to the bottom of it, assuming initially that this was just a clerical error, or maybe Daniel had been sent to a different facility by mistake. I spent the rest of that afternoon on the phone, calling every psychiatric hospital within a 100-mile radius, even reaching out to general hospitals with psychiatric wards. Each conversation went the same way. No patient by that name, no transfer from Greenwood on that date, no record in their systems at all. By 5 o'clock, I'd contacted 17 different facilities, and my notepad was covered in crossed-out hospital names and phone numbers. The transport company that supposedly handled the transfer, MedTrans Solutions, had a record of picking Daniel up at 3:47 a.m. on a Saturday, with a driver named Carl Brenner signing off on the paperwork. But when I called MedTrans back to get more details, they said Carl had quit 2 days after that transport, left no forwarding information, and his employee file had somehow gotten corrupted in their system. That night, I stayed at the office until almost midnight, pulling transfer records from the past year. What I found made my mouth go dry. Daniel wasn't an isolated case. In the past 8 months, we'd had 14 patients transferred to various facilities during overnight or early morning hours, always on weekends, when administrative staff weren't around. The receiving hospitals were scattered across 3 states, never the same one twice, and when I started making verification calls the next morning, not a single facility had any record of these patients arriving. The transfer orders all looked legitimate, signed by Dr. Reynolds or Dr. Patel, both respected psychiatrists who'd been with Greenwood for over a decade. But when I checked the duty rosters, neither doctor had been on call during most of these transfers. Someone was forging signatures, and they were good at it. I only noticed because Dr. Patel always drew a tiny circle instead of a dot over her lowercase i's, and these signatures had regular dots. I decided to cross-reference our transfer records with missing persons reports in the surrounding counties, which meant spending my lunch breaks at the public library because their computers had access to databases I couldn't reach from work. The librarian, Mrs. Garner, started recognizing me after the 3rd day, always offering me the same corner computer where nobody could see my screen. It took me 2 weeks of searching, but I found something that made me physically ill. 3 of our transferred patients had been reported missing by their families, but the reports had been filed weeks after the supposed transfers. The families had been told their loved ones had been moved to long-term care facilities that required limited contact during the adjustment period. One family had even received typed letters, supposedly from their daughter, saying she was doing better and asking them not to visit yet. The handwriting expert they'd hired said the signature looked authentic, but something about the language felt wrong to them, too formal, missing the little phrases their daughter always used. My biggest mistake was taking this information to my supervisor, Howard Finch, a man I'd trusted for 6 years who'd always supported my advocacy for patients. Howard sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, while I laid out everything I'd found: the missing patients, the forged signatures, the pattern of weekend transfers, the transport company irregularities. His expression never changed, not even when I showed him the missing persons reports that matched our transferred patients. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me I was stressed, that my divorce was affecting my judgment, that I needed to take some personal time. He said these transfer discrepancies were probably just bureaucratic mix-ups that would sort themselves out, and that I was connecting dots that didn't need connecting. But the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, the way he kept glancing at his phone like he was waiting for something, it told me he knew exactly what was happening. He offered me 2 weeks paid leave to reset and refocus, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't really an offer. I refused the leave and went back to my office, but over the next few days, Things started getting strange in ways that made me constantly check my rearview mirror during my commute. My keycard suddenly had restricted access, blocking me from the records room I'd used freely for years. Patient files I'd been working on disappeared from my desk, and when I asked about them, people claimed they'd never existed. Colleagues who'd always been friendly started avoiding me in the hallways, conversations stopping abruptly when I walked into the break room. Doctor. Patel pulled me aside one afternoon near the parking garage, pretending to look for her keys while she whispered that I should be careful, that some questions were dangerous to ask, that she'd seen what happened to people who dug too deep. Before I could ask what she meant, she walked away quickly, and the next day I heard she'd taken an unexpected sabbatical to care for a sick relative nobody knew she had. The breaking point came when I received a call at 2 a.m. from a blocked number. Just breathing at first, then a distorted voice telling me that my concern for patients was admirable but misguided. They knew about my visits to the library, about the copies I'd made, about the flash drive I kept in my car's glove compartment with all my research. They suggested I think about my own well-being, about how accidents could happen to people who worked late and drove home on dark roads. The next morning, I found my car tires slashed in the employee parking lot, and security claimed their cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the night. But what really terrified me was finding Daniel Hoffman's patient bracelet tucked under my windshield wiper, the one he should have been wearing when he was transferred. It still had dried blood on the edges, and the date hadn't been updated since the day he supposedly left our facility. That morning, I called in sick and drove straight to the police station, carrying a box of copied documents, my research notes, and Daniel's bracelet in a sealed plastic bag. Detective Ruiz listened to my story for about 10 minutes before his partner got a phone call that made them both step outside. When they came back, Ruiz's entire demeanor had changed. Suddenly, I was the one being questioned about why I'd been accessing confidential patient records, why I'd been harassing other medical facilities with false inquiries, why I'd stolen property from the hospital. They'd received a call from Greenwood's legal department about a rogue employee with a history of mental health issues following her divorce. There were apparently concerns about my fitness for duty, documentation of erratic behavior that I'd never seen before, even a psychiatric evaluation recommending immediate intervention that had my forged signature on it. The detective suggested I leave before they had to formally charge me with theft and high-pay violations, and the way his hand rested on his service weapon made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. I went home and started packing immediately, throwing clothes into suitcases while refreshing my email on my phone. The termination letter arrived before I'd even finished packing. Gross misconduct, breach of patient confidentiality, immediate effect. Legal action if I came near the facility. My professional license was under review. My bank account had already been flagged for the supposed theft of hospital property. And when I tried to call Mrs. Hoffman to warn her, I found out she'd withdrawn her complaint after being told her son had contacted the hospital to say he was fine and didn't want contact with his family. The transport company I'd been investigating, MedTrans Solutions, had filed a restraining order against me for harassment. Even the library had banned me, claiming I'd been using their computers for illegal activities. In less than 6 hours, my entire life had been systematically destroyed, and all because I'd tried to find out what happened to 14 people nobody else seemed to care about. I left town that same night, driving 12 hours straight to stay with my sister in Arizona, constantly checking my mirrors for anyone following me. For 3 months, I laid low, avoiding social media, paying everything in cash, working temporary jobs under the table while trying to rebuild some semblance of a life. But I couldn't stop thinking about those 14 patients, about their families who'd never get answers, about what kind of operation could make people vanish so completely and silence anyone who asked questions. Then one evening, I saw a news report about a medical waste facility being investigated in Nevada after human remains were found improperly disposed of. The facility had contracts with several psychiatric hospitals, including Greenwood Medical Center. The investigation was shut down within a week, blamed on contaminated animal research materials, but one detail stuck with me. The whistleblower who'd reported it, a waste management employee named Carl Brenner, had died in a car accident 2 days before he was supposed to testify. Same Carl Brenner who'd signed off on Daniel's transport paperwork and quit immediately after. I'm sharing this here because I've changed my name, moved states twice more, and taken every precaution I can think of, but I know they're still watching. Last month, I saw Howard Finch's obituary online. Sudden heart attack at 52, no prior health issues, private funeral with no service. Dr. Patel's sabbatical became permanent retirement, and she seemingly vanished as completely as those patients. Greenwood Medical Center is still operating, still transferring patients on weekend nights, and families are still being told their loved ones are getting specialized care elsewhere. I've accepted that I'll never be able to practice social work again, that my old life is gone forever, and that those 14 people are probably never coming back. But maybe someone reading this has noticed similar patterns at their facility. Maybe someone else is keeping track of mysterious transfers and missing patients. Don't make my mistake of trusting the system to investigate itself. Document everything. Protect yourself first. And remember that sometimes the real horror isn't what we imagine in the dark. It's what happens in medical facilities at 3 a.m. when nobody's watching, hidden behind bureaucracy and transfer paperwork, where human beings become disposable, and anyone who asks questions becomes a problem to be solved. I started working as an orderly at Riverside General Hospital in the spring of 2016, right after my divorce was finalized. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid decent money and came with benefits I desperately needed. Most days I cleaned rooms, transported patients, and helped with whatever the nurses needed. The hospital itself was old, built sometime in the 1950s with that institutional yellow brick exterior and narrow windows that barely let in any light. After 6 months on the job, I thought I knew every corner of that place, the shortcuts through the old cardiac wing, which vending machines still worked, where to catch a quick nap between shifts. But that Wednesday in November changed everything when my supervisor, a stocky guy named Frank, asked me to help check some ventilation systems in the basement. The basement always gave me an uneasy feeling, but that day something was different. Frank led me past the usual storage areas and the laundry facilities, down a corridor I'd never noticed before. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. We walked for what seemed like 10 minutes through a maze of hallways, each turn taking us deeper into the building's foundation. The air grew thicker, mustier, and I noticed the usual hospital sounds. The beeping machines, the intercoms, the constant foot traffic had completely faded away. Frank stopped at a heavy metal door marked only with B7 in fading paint. When he pushed it open, the hinges groaned like they hadn't moved in decades. What I saw behind that door made me stop dead in my tracks. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with thick gray padding, the kind you'd see in a recording studio, and every door in that hallway had rubber seals around the edges. Frank must have noticed my confusion because he quickly mumbled something about old psychiatric treatment rooms from the 70s. He said they used to do specialized therapy down here, whatever that meant, but assured me the wing had been abandoned for at least 15 years. The way he avoided eye contact when he said it made my gut twist. We were supposed to check the ventilation system, make sure no mold was growing in the old ducts, but I couldn't focus on the task. Every room we entered had the same setup: padded walls, reinforced doors with small windows at eye level, and ventilation grates that had been welded shut. In one room, I noticed scratch marks on the padding near the floor, deep gouges that had torn through multiple layers. Frank pretended not to see them, just kept checking items off his clipboard and talking about basketball scores. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about that hallway. During my graveyard shift, around 2 a.m. when the hospital was at its quietest, I decided to go back down there alone. I told myself I was being ridiculous, That Frank's explanation made perfect sense, but something kept nagging at me. I grabbed a flashlight from the supply closet and made my way back through those winding basement corridors. The further I went, the more the temperature seemed to drop, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the beam of my flashlight. When I finally reached the B7 door again, I stood there for a full minute just listening. At first, there was nothing but the distant hum of the building's machinery. Then I heard it. A rhythmic tapping, barely audible through all that soundproofing. 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 3 more, like someone knocking on a door asking to be let out. I pressed my ear against the cold metal door, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. The tapping continued, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, but always in that same pattern. I tried the door handle, but it was locked, and my maintenance keys didn't work on it. That's when I noticed something else. Fresh scratches around the lock mechanism, like someone had recently tried to pick it. The dust on the floor had been disturbed too, showing multiple sets of footprints leading to and from the door. For a place that supposedly hadn't been used in 15 years, there was an awful lot of recent activity. I took photos with my phone, making sure to capture the scratches and the footprint patterns. The tapping suddenly stopped, and in the silence that followed, I could swear I heard breathing on the other side of the door, slow, deliberate breaths that fogged up the small window from the inside. The next day, I went straight to the head of maintenance, a woman named Gloria who'd been at the hospital for 30 years. I showed her the photos and told her about the sounds. Her face went pale, and she immediately closed her office door before speaking. She told me that in 2014, just 2 years before I started, there had been an incident in that wing. A patient named Douglas Hartley had somehow gotten access to the basement during a fire drill and barricaded himself in one of those rooms. It took security 3 days to get him out, and when they did, he was catatonic. The strange part was that Douglas had been admitted for minor anxiety, nothing that would explain such extreme behavior. After that incident, the hospital board voted to seal off that wing permanently. But here's what made my skin prickle. Gloria said Douglas was still a patient at the hospital, kept in the long-term psychiatric ward on the 4th floor. And according to the night nurses, he still tapped that same pattern on his room door every single night. I couldn't let it go. That evening, I convinced my colleague Rita to cover for me while I went up to the psychiatric ward. The 4th floor had stricter security protocols, but as an orderly, I had just enough access to walk through during my rounds. I found Douglas's room at the end of a dimly lit hallway, room 4B12. Through the reinforced glass window, I could see him sitting on his bed, rocking slightly back and forth. He was maybe 60 years old, thin as a rail, with gray hair that hung over his eyes. When he noticed me watching, he stood up and walked to the door. Without breaking eye contact, he raised his knuckle and tapped 3 times on the glass, paused, then 3 more times. His lips moved like he was trying to tell me something, but no sound came through the thick door. I watched his mouth carefully, trying to read his lips. Over and over, he seemed to be mouthing the same 2 words, "Still there." That's when things got worse. I started digging through old hospital records during my lunch breaks, using my access to the digitized archives. What I found made no sense at first. Maintenance logs from 2013 showed extensive renovation work in the B7 wing, including the installation of specialized containment infrastructure. But the renovation was completed a full year before Douglas ever set foot in that basement. The work orders were all signed by a Dr. Nathan Crowley, who supposedly headed a research program at the hospital. But when I searched for Dr. Crowley in the employee database, no records came up. I checked with HR, claiming I needed to verify some old paperwork, and they had no record of anyone by that name ever working at Riverside General. The more I investigated, the stranger it became. Purchase orders for medical equipment that didn't match anything we used in regular treatment, delivery receipts for industrial-grade restraints, and requisitions for enough sedatives to keep someone unconscious for weeks. 2 nights later, I made a decision that still haunts me. I went back to B7 with a crowbar I'd taken from my truck. The hallway was pitch black except for my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The tapping started immediately when I arrived, more urgent this time, almost frantic. I wedged the crowbar into the door frame and put all my weight behind it. The lock was strong, but the frame was old, and after several minutes of prying, I heard the wood splinter. The door swung open, releasing a wave of stale, medicinal air that made me gag. Inside, the room was exactly like the others I'd seen, except for one detail. In the corner, partially hidden behind loose padding, was a small ventilation grate that hadn't been welded shut. Fresh air was flowing through it, and when I knelt down to look closer, I could see scratch marks all around it, like someone had been trying to pry it open from the inside. The tapping sound was coming from the ventilation shaft itself. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, angling it into the vent. What I saw made me stumble backward and nearly drop the phone. There was another room visible through the shaft, one that wasn't on any blueprint I'd seen. The walls were bare concrete, and there was medical equipment everywhere. IV stands, monitoring devices, and what looked like a dental chair modified with leather straps. But that wasn't the worst part. On the far wall, I could see photographs pinned up, dozens of them. Even from that distance, I could make out that they were patient photos, the kind we take for admission records. Some of them looked recent. I recognized at least 3 faces from the long-term ward, including Douglas. I tried to angle my phone to record video evidence, but then I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped right outside the door. I turned around slowly, and there was Frank standing in the doorway, but he wasn't alone. 2 security guards flanked him, and behind them stood a man in a white coat I'd never seen before. The man in the white coat stepped forward, introducing himself as Dr. Richard Steinberg, the hospital's chief of psychiatric services. His voice was calm, almost soothing, as he explained that I had stumbled onto a classified treatment program for patients with severe dissociative disorders. He claimed the hidden room was used for immersive therapy sessions, approved by a special medical board, and that the secrecy was necessary to protect patient privacy and prevent public misunderstanding. He offered to show me the proper documentation, even suggested I could be transferred to a better-paying position if I signed some confidentiality agreements. But while he talked, I noticed Frank's hand resting on his belt, right where security usually carried their tasers. The 2 guards had positioned themselves to block any exit route. Dr. Steinberg kept talking about medical ethics and revolutionary treatments, but his eyes were cold, calculating, watching my every reaction. I played along, nodding and apologizing for the misunderstanding, saying I just wanted to do my job properly. After what felt like hours but was probably 10 minutes, they escorted me back to the main floor and sent me home, telling me to take a few days off to process what I'd learned. I never went back. That same night, I packed everything I could fit in my car and drove to my sister's place 3 states away. Before I left, I uploaded all the photos and videos I'd taken to multiple cloud services and sent copies to a journalist friend, though she never published anything. Said her editor killed the story after a call from the hospital's lawyers. I found out later that Douglas had been transferred to another facility the day after my discovery, and his records were sealed. Frank called me twice, leaving voicemails about my final paycheck and returning my uniform, but I never responded. About a month later, I saw a small news item about Riverside General receiving a massive private grant for expanding mental health services. The article mentioned new underground facilities being constructed, but didn't give details. I work at a small clinic now, far from any large hospitals. Sometimes I still wake up at 2 a.m., and I swear I can hear that tapping pattern in my head. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. I looked up Douglas Hartley online once, but found only an obituary from 6 months after I left. The cause of death was listed as complications from long-term psychiatric treatment. I don't know what they were doing in that basement, and honestly, I don't want to know. But sometimes I think about the other patients whose photos were on that wall, and I wonder if they're still tapping somewhere, waiting for someone to listen. Working nights at Millbrook's psychiatric facility seemed like easy money when they first hired me. 28 years old, fresh certification in hand, student loans crushing my bank account. That night shift differential looked pretty sweet on paper. Amy, my girlfriend at the time, kept joking about me losing my mind working graveyard at a mental institution. But honestly, most shifts were boring as hell. Unit 7 housed long-term residents, people who'd been cycling through the same medications and routines for years. Severe schizophrenia cases, treatment-resistant bipolar, chronic depression, heavy diagnoses that required round-the-clock monitoring. My job consisted mainly of medication rounds, documenting patient behaviors, checking vitals, making sure nobody hurt themselves or others during those long, quiet hours between midnight and dawn. Strange how a building full of troubled minds could feel so peaceful at 3 a.m. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional murmur from behind a closed door. You get used to the rhythm of it, the way certain patients pace at specific times, which rooms stay silent, which ones you'll hear crying softly when they think nobody's listening. Wednesday night in August changed everything. Humid as hell outside, the AC struggling to keep up, making the whole ward feel sticky and oppressive. Dorothy Caldwell, room 714, had been with us for almost 4 years. 67 years old, sweet lady when her meds were balanced right. Used to teach elementary school before her depression got too severe to function. That night at 3:15 a.m., her room alarm started shrieking. That specific pitch that means medical emergency, not just a fall or panic attack. Found her gasping for air, skin going gray, pupils pinned to tiny dots. Classic signs of medication overdose, except Dorothy had been stable on the same cocktail for 3 straight years. We managed to stabilize her, got her transferred to the medical wing, but when I went to check the medication administration record, something was wrong. The 9:47 p.m. dose was signed KB, initials that meant absolutely nothing to me. Every nurse, every tech, every float staff member who worked our unit, I knew them all. Nobody had those initials. Bethany, our charge nurse, barely glanced at the log when I brought it to her attention, just mumbled something about staff from other units helping out, told me to focus on my remaining patients. 2 nights later, it happened again. Gerald Foster, room 709, a 44-year-old man with severe bipolar disorder who'd been stable for 18 months. Found him during my 2 a.m. rounds, convulsing in his bed, foam around his mouth, his roommate screaming for help. Same symptoms as Dorothy: respiratory depression, pinpoint pupils, all the hallmarks of an antipsychotic overdose. Gerald was a big guy, worked construction before his illness took over. Always talked about getting back to building houses once he got out. Seeing him like that, helpless and choking on his own saliva, it hit different. While the medical team worked on him, I went straight to the medication logs. There it was again. Evening dose at 10:22 p.m. signed RJ. Nobody on our staff had those initials either. I started keeping my own notes in a pocket notebook, writing down every detail. The medication room had a keypad lock that logged every entry, so I checked those records against the MAR signatures. According to the keypad log, nobody had accessed the medication room between 8 p.m. and midnight on either night. How could someone administer medications without entering the room where they were stored? My shift partner, a guy named Aaron who'd been working psych wards for 12 years, noticed me getting obsessed with the paperwork. He pulled me aside near the nurse's station, kept his voice low, told me stories about Millbrook that made my skin prickle. Apparently, medication discrepancies had been happening for years, always at night, always with different initials that belonged to nobody. Staff who asked too many questions got transferred to different units, or their contracts suddenly weren't renewed. Aaron said he learned early on to keep his head down, do his job, not dig too deep into things that didn't add up. But I couldn't let it go, especially when I realized the overdoses followed a pattern. Always patients who were close to being discharged or stepped down to lower security units. Dorothy had been approved for assisted living placement the week before her overdose. Gerald's psychiatrist had just recommended transitioning him to outpatient care. These weren't random incidents. Someone was deliberately keeping these patients from leaving, and they were using enough medication to cause serious harm without killing them outright. Against Aaron's advice, I started documenting everything with my phone. Screenshots of the medication logs, photos of the keypad entry records, even pictures of the actual medication bottles in the dispensary. On my nights off, I'd spread everything out on my kitchen table, trying to make sense of the patterns. Amy thought I was losing it, said I was starting to act like the paranoid patients at work. But the evidence was right there. In the past 6 months alone, 14 patients had suffered unexplained overdoses, all during night shifts, all with mystery initials on their MARs. What really got to me was finding the insurance billing records left open on a computer one night. Millbrook was billing for full doses of medications that were supposedly being administered by these phantom nurses. If patients were getting overdosed, that meant someone was giving them extra medication beyond what was being officially dispensed. Where were these extra doses coming from? The pharmacy inventory matched the official MAR records perfectly, every pill accounted for on paper. Monday night, almost 2 weeks after Dorothy's incident, I decided to watch the medication room myself. Positioned myself where I could see the door but still look like I was doing paperwork at the nurse's station. Around 10:15 p.m., Bethany, our charge nurse, walked past me heading toward the patient rooms, carrying her usual medication tray. Nothing unusual, except she wasn't scheduled for medication rounds. That was supposed to be handled by the floor nurse, Jennifer. 20 minutes later, I heard a code blue from room 706. Mrs. Helen Bauer, 58 years old, chronic schizophrenia with catatonic features, was found unresponsive by Jennifer during routine checks. Same presentation as the others, respiratory distress, pinpoint pupils, lucky to be alive. When I checked the MAR, there it was, 10:17 p.m., signed MT. But here's what made me sick to my stomach. I had been watching that medication room door the entire time, and Bethany never entered it. She had walked past with a full tray of medications that came from nowhere, doses that didn't exist in our inventory, administered by initials that belonged to no one. The next hour felt like walking through thick mud, every second stretching out while I tried to process what I'd witnessed, helped stabilize Helen, filled out incident reports, acted normal while my mind raced through the implications. Bethany had access to medications that weren't in our system, which meant she was either stealing from other units or had an outside source. But why risk everything just to keep patients from being discharged? Around 4 a.m. while doing rounds, I found myself outside the administrative offices. The door to human resources was cracked open. Someone had forgotten to pull it completely shut. Every instinct told me to walk away, but I slipped inside, went straight to the filing cabinets. Started with the B section, looking for Bethany's file. What I found made me physically ill. Bethany didn't just work at Millbrook. She was married to Dr. Eugene Morrison, the facility's medical director. Their last name difference had kept it hidden from casual observation. But that wasn't the worst part. In a folder marked Budget Reviews, I found spreadsheets showing that Unit 7 was scheduled for closure if occupancy dropped below 85% for 3 consecutive months. We'd been hovering right at that threshold, and every time we dipped below, another mysterious overdose would occur, keeping the patient from discharge. Millbrook was a private facility that relied heavily on state contracts for long-term psychiatric care. Each occupied bed brought in roughly $400 per day from insurance and state funding. Keeping just 5 extra patients meant $60,000 per month in revenue. The math was right there in black and white. Every overdose that delayed a discharge was worth thousands of dollars to the facility. But Dr. Morrison and Bethany weren't just protecting jobs or keeping a unit open. They had recently purchased a massive house according to a mortgage document carelessly left in the printer. They were living way beyond what their salaries could support. Aaron found me in that office at 5 a.m., white as a sheet, papers scattered across the desk. He didn't say anything, just started helping me put everything back exactly as I'd found it. As we worked in silence, he whispered that 3 other nurses had noticed the same patterns over the years. One had gone to the state health department, but the investigator who showed up was Dr. Morrison's golf buddy. Another tried contacting the media, but Millbrook's lawyers shut it down with threats of lawsuits for violating patient privacy. The third nurse, a woman named Carol, had collected evidence for months before suddenly moving out of state, leaving no forwarding address. That morning, I went home and told Amy everything. She wanted me to quit immediately, pack up and leave town just like Carol had done. But I kept thinking about Dorothy, Gerald, Helen, and all the other patients who'd been poisoned for profit. These were vulnerable people who came to us for help, trusting us with their lives while they battled their own minds. The violation of that trust made me physically sick. I spent my day off copying every piece of evidence onto multiple USB drives, uploaded files to cloud storage accounts, even mailed a package to my cousin who lived in California. If something happened to me, at least the proof would survive. When I returned for my next shift on Friday night, the atmosphere was different. Bethany smiled at me more than usual, kept asking how I was feeling, if I was stressed about anything. Jennifer mentioned that Dr. Morrison had been asking about me, wondering if I was adjusting well to the night shift responsibilities. Even the security guard, usually friendly and chatty, seemed to watch me more carefully. Around 1 a.m., Aaron pulled me into the supply closet, told me that Bethany had been asking him questions about what I did during my shifts, who I talked to, whether I'd mentioned anything unusual. At 2:47 a.m., while I was documenting patient notes at the nursing station, I noticed Bethany heading toward the medication room with her unauthorized tray again. But this time, she was walking toward room 718. My assigned patient for the night, Roger Hoffman, a 51-year-old man with severe PTSD who was scheduled for discharge to a group home next week. Without thinking, I followed her. She was so focused on preparing the syringe that she didn't hear me enter the room behind her. Roger was asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful, unaware that he was about to become another casualty of their scheme. When I cleared my throat, Bethany spun around, the loaded syringe still in her hand. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she started talking, her voice eerily calm, explaining how this was bigger than both of us, how the whole facility would shut down if the unit closed, how hundreds of people would lose their jobs. She actually tried to make it sound noble, like poisoning patients was some kind of twisted sacrifice for the greater good. I told her I had already documented everything, that copies were in safe places, and if anything happened to me or any other patient, it would all go public. The syringe in her hand trembled slightly, and for the first time since I'd known her, Bethany looked genuinely scared. She set it down on the bedside table, her shoulders sagging like all the air had been let out of her. Then she said something that chilled me more than anything else that night, that I had no idea how many people were involved, how many families depended on Millbrook staying profitable. She named names, the head of security, 2 psychiatrists, 3 day shift nurses, even someone at the state inspection office. They all knew, all benefited somehow, whether through direct payments or just job security. She asked me what I thought would happen if I went public. Did I really think anyone would believe a rookie tech over respected medical professionals? Did I know how easy it would be to discredit me, maybe even frame me for the overdoses? But I had one advantage she didn't know about. Earlier that week, I'd reached out to a journalist from the state's largest newspaper, a woman named Grace Novak who specialized in healthcare fraud. She was already investigating similar patterns at 2 other private psychiatric facilities. My evidence was exactly what she needed to blow the whole thing wide open. Grace published the story 5 days later, complete with documentation I'd provided, and statements from 2 former employees who came forward after seeing the initial report. The FBI raided Millbrook that same morning, seizing records and arresting Dr. Morrison, Bethany, and 4 others. The facility lost its state contracts within a month and shut down completely by September. 43 patients had suffered overdoses over 3 years, all to maintain occupancy rates and profit margins. Some recovered fully, Others had permanent organ damage from the repeated poisonings. Dorothy Caldwell testified at the trial, her hands still shaking from the neurological damage, but her voice steady as she described waking up unable to breathe. Dr. Morrison got 15 years, Bethany got 12, and the others received lesser sentences in exchange for cooperation. I left psychiatric nursing after that. Couldn't trust myself to care for vulnerable patients without constantly questioning everyone's motives. Now I work in medical equipment sales, boring as hell, but nobody's life depends on me. Sometimes I wake up at 3:15 a.m., that exact time when I found Dorothy struggling to breathe, and I wonder how many other facilities are running the same scheme. How many patients are being kept sick for profit? How many staff members are keeping quiet out of fear or complicity? I've worked as a records clerk for 7 years now, and in all that time at Westbrook Psychiatric Facility, I thought I'd seen every kind of administrative mess you could imagine. It was a Friday in early December when everything started, one of those gray afternoons where the fluorescent lights feel heavier than usual. I was sorting through discharge summaries in the basement archives, a windowless room that smelled like old paper and industrial cleaner. The job wasn't glamorous, but I took pride in keeping everything organized, making sure every patient's journey through our facility was properly documented. That afternoon, I was updating our digital database with paper files from emergency admissions, routine work I could do with my eyes closed. My supervisor, Mrs. Thompson, had asked me to focus on clearing the backlog from the previous month before the state inspection in 2 weeks. I remember drinking my third cup of coffee, the bitter taste mixing with the dust from the old files, completely unaware that I was about to stumble onto something that would change everything about how I saw my workplace. The first irregularity appeared when I was entering data for a patient named Brandon Sawyer, a 28-year-old man admitted on a 72-hour psychiatric hold after a severe manic episode. His intake paperwork was thorough, detailed notes from the attending psychiatrist, medication logs, observation reports from the nurses for the first 48 hours. But then, nothing. No discharge summary, no transfer papers, no against medical advice form. Absolutely nothing to indicate how or when he left our facility. The file just stopped mid-treatment, like someone had torn out the last chapter of a book. I figured it was a clerical error. Maybe someone forgot to file the discharge papers, which happens more often than we'd like to admit. I made a note to follow up with the ward secretary and moved on to the next file. But then I found another one just like it. A woman named Lisa Garrett admitted for acute psychosis, detailed records for 3 days, then nothing, then another, and another. By the time I'd gone through 50 files, I'd found 7 patients with the same pattern: emergency admission, a few days of detailed documentation, then complete radio silence. What really caught my attention was the signature on all 7 intake forms: Dr. Martin Holloway, our senior administrator. Now, Holloway wasn't just any administrator. He was basically untouchable. Been with the hospital for 23 years. Golf buddies with the board members. The kind of guy who wore expensive suits and always smelled like cologne that probably cost more than my weekly paycheck. He had this peculiar habit of clicking his pen exactly 3 times before signing any document, and his signature was this elaborate cursive that looked like it belonged on the Declaration of Independence. Finding his name on all 7 files made me pause because senior administrators rarely handle direct admissions. That's usually left to the attending physicians. I pulled up our internal directory and cross-referenced the admission dates. All 7 patients came in during night shifts, specifically between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., when the hospital operated with skeleton staff. The timing wasn't necessarily suspicious on its own. Emergency psychiatric holds often come in during odd hours. But it was another connection that made me lean back in my creaky office chair and stare at the ceiling tiles. I decided to check the ward assignment logs to see where these patients had been housed during their stay. Our facility has 4 main units: Unit A for voluntary admissions, Unit B for acute care, Unit C for long-term residents, and Unit D, which was technically our overflow unit but rarely used because of budget constraints. All 7 missing patients had been assigned to Unit D, specifically to rooms 401 through 407, a section of the building that I knew had been closed for renovations 6 months ago. The renovation story never quite added up because I'd processed the work orders myself, and they were all for minor repairs, replacing ceiling tiles, fixing a broken window latch, nothing that would require closing an entire wing for half a year. I grabbed my access badge and decided to take a walk during my lunch break, telling myself I was just stretching my legs, but really I wanted to see Unit D for myself. The hallway leading to it was dimmer than the rest of the hospital. Half the fluorescent bulbs either broken or removed, and there was this persistent dripping sound coming from somewhere behind the walls, probably a pipe that needed fixing. When I reached the doors to Unit D, they were locked with a digital keypad that I didn't have the code for, but through the small window, I could see lights on inside, shadows moving across the far wall like someone was walking around in there. That afternoon, I went back to my desk and did something I probably shouldn't have. I accessed the billing system with my credentials to see if those 7 patients were still being charged for their stay. The hospital's billing software was ancient, running on some program from the early 2000s that looked like it belonged in a museum, but it kept meticulous records of every single charge, down to individual aspirin tablets. Brandon Sawyer's account showed active daily charges for room and board, medications, even therapy sessions that, according to his medical file, never happened. Lisa Garrett's insurance was being billed $3,200 per day for intensive psychiatric care, and the charges were current as in processed yesterday. My mouth went dry as I checked the others. All 7 accounts were active, accumulating charges, some for over 3 weeks now. The system showed them as current patients in Unit D, receiving round-the-clock care, meals, medications, the whole package. But according to their medical files, they'd all stopped existing after day 3 of their admission. I printed everything, my old printer groaning and squeaking as it spit out page after page of billing records, the evidence piling up on my desk like a paper mountain of impossibilities. I needed to talk to someone, but I had to be careful about who I trusted. There was Donna from Human Resources. She'd been at the hospital almost as long as me, and had this way of knowing everyone's business without seeming like a gossip. I found her in the cafeteria during the dinner break, sitting alone at a corner table, picking at a sad-looking Caesar salad. When I sat down across from her, she looked up with those sharp brown eyes that seemed to read your mind before you even spoke. I asked her, casual as I could manage, if she knew anything about Unit D still being operational. She put down her fork, leaned in close enough that I could smell her lavender hand lotion, and told me something that made every hair on my arm stand up. 2 weeks ago, she'd processed paperwork for 3 new nurses, all hired specifically for Unit D night shifts, all with out-of-state licenses, all with references that when she tried to verify them, led to disconnected phone numbers. But Holloway had personally vouched for them, said they were specialists in some new treatment program the hospital was piloting. She'd found it odd that there was no announcement about any new program, no staff meetings, no training sessions, nothing in the hospital newsletter that usually couldn't shut up about every minor achievement or initiative. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about those patients, wondering where they really were, what was happening to them. I stayed late at the office, pretending to work on the backlog, but really I was digging deeper into the system. I found something in the pharmacy logs that turned my stomach into a knot of anxiety. Unit D had been ordering massive quantities of sedatives, specifically midazolam and propofol, drugs typically used for surgical procedures, not psychiatric treatment. The amounts were staggering, enough to keep dozens of people unconscious for extended periods. The orders were all signed off by Dr. Holloway and fulfilled by a pharmacy supplier I'd never seen in our system before, somewhere called MedLink Distributors. When I searched for MedLink online, I found a bare-bones website with a single page, no employee information, no history, just a contact form and a warehouse address in an industrial district 40 miles away. The domain had been registered just 2 months ago, right around the time the first of those 7 patients had been admitted. I also discovered that our regular pharmacy supplier had noted several inquiries about why their orders had decreased significantly, concerns that had been dismissed by administrative emails bearing Holloway's digital signature. I knew I was getting into dangerous territory, but I couldn't let it go. The next day was Saturday, and the hospital would be running on weekend staff, meaning fewer people around to notice me snooping. I came in early, around 6 a.m., using my overtime excuse that Mrs. Thompson had already approved for the inspection prep. The main building was eerily quiet, just the hum of ventilation systems and distant footsteps of the night shift finishing their rounds. I made my way to the administrative wing where Holloway's office was located, my heartbeat pounding in my ears with each step. His office door was locked, naturally, but I remembered that the janitor's closet next door shared a ventilation grate with his office. I'd heard his phone conversations plenty of times while grabbing cleaning supplies. Inside the closet, between bottles of industrial bleach and floor wax, I pressed my ear against the metal grate. I could hear voices, Holloway's distinctive baritone and someone else with a slight accent I couldn't place. They were discussing transport arrangements, something about keeping the subject stable during the journey, maintaining proper documentation for customs, and ensuring the receiving facility was prepared for the delivery. The other voice mentioned a number, 50,000 per unit, and Holloway laughed that dry laugh he did during budget meetings, saying they could process at least 2 more this month without raising suspicions. My legs were trembling as I backed away from the grate, knocking over a mop bucket in my haste. The clatter echoed through the empty hallway, and I heard the voices in Holloway's office stop abruptly. I grabbed a mop, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst, pretending to clean the floor just as his office door opened. Holloway stepped out with another man I'd never seen before. Tall, thin, wearing an expensive-looking gray suit with a red pocket square, his face angular and forgettable except for his eyes, which were this unsettling pale blue, almost white. They both looked at me, and Holloway's expression shifted through several emotions. Surprise, suspicion, then that practiced administrative smile he wore like armor. He asked what I was doing there so early, and I managed to stammer something about the state inspection, about Mrs. Thompson wanting everything spotless. The other man whispered something in what sounded like Russian or Ukrainian, and Holloway nodded, told me to carry on, but his eyes lingered on me a beat too long before they walked toward the elevator. I mopped that same spot for 5 minutes, my arms moving on autopilot while my brain tried to process what I'd heard. 50,000 per unit. They were talking about the patients like cargo, like products to be shipped and sold. I abandoned any pretense of cleaning and headed straight back to Unit D, this time taking the long way through the old wing where they stored discontinued medical equipment. There was a connecting corridor there, mostly forgotten, that led to the back entrance of Unit D. I'd seen it on the old blueprints when we digitized them years ago. The door was locked, but it was one of those ancient mechanical locks, not electronic, and the frame was so warped from age that I could see into the hallway beyond. What I saw made me bite my tongue to keep from gasping. There were gurneys lined up against the wall, at least 6 of them, each with a patient strapped down, IVs running into their arms, their faces slack and unconscious. I recognized Brandon Sawyer immediately. His distinctive neck tattoo of a compass was visible even from where I stood. The patients were all dressed in what looked like airline passenger clothes, not hospital gowns, complete with shoes and jackets. A woman in scrubs I didn't recognize was checking their vitals, making notes on a clipboard, her movements efficient and practiced like she'd done this routine 100 times. She had earbuds in, humming something tuneless, completely absorbed in her work. Near the far end of the hallway, I could see suitcases stacked neatly, each one tagged with what looked like airline labels, and a pile of passports on a medical cart. I backed away from the door, my whole body shaking now, and pulled out my phone to start recording video through the gap in the door frame. I managed to get about 30 seconds of footage, the patients, the nurse, the suitcases, before I heard footsteps coming from the main corridor. I actually ran through the old wing, my sensible work shoes slapping against the linoleum, past the defunct X-ray machines and broken wheelchairs, until I reached the parking garage. In my car, I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the video on my phone. It was grainy, but clear enough to see what was happening. I drove straight to the police station downtown, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. But when I walked into that station, showed them my hospital ID, and started explaining about patients being trafficked, the desk sergeant's expression changed from bored to concerned to something else entirely. He asked me to wait, said he'd get a detective. But instead, 2 uniformed officers appeared and told me I needed to come with them for questioning. They put me in a small room that smelled like old coffee and disappointment, and I waited there for 2 hours before someone finally came in. Not a detective, but Holloway himself, accompanied by the hospital's legal counsel, and a woman who introduced herself as being from the state health department. They had a different story ready, all official documents and medical terminology. According to them, I'd stumbled onto a legitimate pilot program for treating severe psychiatric patients in specialized facilities abroad, all perfectly legal, all with proper consent from either the patients during lucid moments or their medical proxies. The woman from the state showed me paperwork with official seals, signatures, approval stamps that looked absolutely real. Holloway explained, in that condescending tone he used during staff meetings, that the secrecy was necessary to protect patient privacy and prevent interference from misguided advocacy groups. The patients I'd seen were being prepared for medical transport to a cutting-edge treatment center in Romania, where experimental therapies not yet approved in the US could offer them hope for recovery. The $50,000 I'd overheard? That was the treatment cost, covered by a special grant from an international mental health foundation. They had an answer for everything, every single thing, papers to prove it all. The hospital's lawyer, a stern woman with steel gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, informed me that I'd violated numerous HIPAA regulations, accessed systems beyond my authorization level, and recorded patients without consent. I could face criminal charges, lose my job, my pension, everything, unless I signed a document acknowledging my misunderstanding and agreeing to confidentiality about the whole matter. They gave me 24 hours to decide. I went home that night knowing I couldn't fight this alone, not against Holloway, the hospital administration, and apparently even the state health department. But I also couldn't let those patients disappear into whatever was really waiting for them in Romania, or wherever they were actually being sent. I made copies of everything, the billing records, the pharmacy logs, the video, and uploaded them to 3 different cloud services, then mailed USB drives to my sister in Oregon and my cousin in Florida with instructions not to open them unless something happened to me. The next morning, Sunday, I did something I'd never imagined doing. I called a journalist from the local newspaper, a guy named Tom Briggs who'd written exposés about nursing home abuse a few years back. We met at a diner outside town, one of those places with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Reagan administration. I showed him everything on my laptop, watched his expression shift from skeptical to intrigued, to genuinely alarmed. He said he needed to verify some things, make some calls, but that this was big, really big. He gave me his personal cell number, told me to sign whatever I needed to sign to protect myself for now, and that he'd work on this quietly. 2 days later, I signed Holloway's papers, went back to work, and pretended everything was normal, filing papers and organizing records like my world hadn't been turned upside down. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. I'd almost started to doubt myself, wondering if maybe there really was some legitimate program I'd misunderstood. Then, on a Monday morning, it all exploded. FBI agents swarmed the hospital, men and women in dark windbreakers with those 3 letters printed in yellow across their backs. They sealed off Unit D, confiscated computers, boxes and boxes of records wheeled out on dollies. Holloway was arrested in the parking lot, handcuffed in front of everyone during the morning shift change. The news broke that afternoon. An international patient trafficking ring that had been operating for over a year selling psychiatric patients to overseas facilities that were actually fronts for illegal medical testing. 17 patients had been recovered from a facility in Moldova, not Romania, all alive but in various states of psychological trauma from whatever experiments had been conducted on them. Brandon Sawyer was among them, and his family's interview on the news was heartbreaking. They'd been told he'd been transferred to a long-term facility upstate, had even received forged letters supposedly from him saying he was getting better. The investigation revealed that the scheme went beyond just our hospital, involving a network of facilities across 3 states, all connected through shell companies and fake medical organizations. Tom Briggs won a Pulitzer for his investigation, though he always credited an anonymous source for bringing the story to light. I still work at the hospital, in the same basement office, filing the same papers, but now I look at everything differently, double-check things that seem odd, and keep Tom's number saved in my phone under pizza delivery, just in case. The 7 patients I'd originally discovered, 6 were recovered alive, still working through what happened to them. 1, Lisa Garrett, was never found, and sometimes I think about her, wonder where she ended up, and hope that somehow, somewhere, she found her way back home. Night shifts at psychiatric wards teach you things nursing school never could. At age 24, fresh out of college with loans crushing my bank account, the job at Clearwater Medical Center in suburban Illinois seemed like a blessing. 6 months into working the psych wing, things had become routine. Medication rounds, patient checks, documentation. The December cold seeped through the old building's windows that year, 2018, making the hallways feel even more sterile than usual. My supervisor Barbara wore these thick glasses that made her eyes look enormous, like she could see straight through your excuses for being 5 minutes late. She'd just promoted me to lead nurse for the night shift, which meant an extra $2 an hour and twice the responsibility. My roommate Jenna and I celebrated with cheap wine that Friday, laughing about how I'd finally be able to afford name-brand cereal. Psychiatric ward wasn't where I'd imagined myself working, but jobs for new nurses were scarce, and I figured I could stick it out for a year or 2. Robert Lawson arrived on the ward 2 days before everything went sideways, brought in for psychiatric evaluation after his family reported concerning behavior changes. His chart showed no violent history, just depression and anxiety following a messy divorce, the kind of case we saw dozens of times each month. When I first encountered him during rounds, he sat motionless in the corner of his room, staring at the beige wall like it held secrets only he could decipher. He took his medications without resistance that Saturday night, nodding politely when I asked if he needed water or an extra blanket. Something about the way he tilted his head while listening reminded me of how my grandmother's parakeet used to watch people through its cage bars, attentive but somehow disconnected. The ward held only 12 patients that weekend instead of our typical 20, and the unusual quiet made every footstep echo down the corridors. I remember planning to actually sit down and eat my sandwich during break, maybe even check my phone without someone pressing the call button every 30 seconds. Around 2 a.m., I started my second round of medication distribution, pushing the squeaky cart down the east wing where Robert's room was located. The fluorescent lights hummed that particular frequency that gives you a headache after 8 hours, and the smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with something else. That distinct psychiatric ward scent of fear and medication sweats that clings to your scrubs no matter how many times you wash them. Robert was awake when I entered his room, sitting up in bed with his hands folded neatly on his lap, which struck me as odd since most patients were deep in their medication-induced sleep by then. His eyes tracked my movements as I prepared his pills, and when I spoke to him about the dosage change his doctor had ordered, explaining that the blue pill would help with his anxiety, he opened his mouth like he wanted to respond. Nothing came out at first, just this soft exhale that sounded like static from an old radio. Then he started speaking, and every hair on my arms stood straight up. "The blue pill will help with your anxiety," he said, but it was my exact words, my exact intonation, coming from his mouth in this warped mechanical way, like someone had recorded my voice and played it back through broken speakers. The way his lips moved didn't quite match the sounds, creating this horrible disconnect that made my chest tighten. I stood there holding the medication cup, trying to process what I'd just heard, telling myself maybe he was just repeating what I'd said. Some patients did that as a coping mechanism. But then he continued, mimicking not just my words but the exact rhythm of my breathing, the way I'd shifted my weight from one foot to the other, even the small throat-clearing sound I'd made before speaking. His eyes never blinked during this whole performance, just stayed locked on mine with this intensity that made me want to back toward the door. The medication cup started trembling in my hand, and he immediately mimicked that too, his own hand shaking in the exact same pattern, though he held nothing. I tried to maintain my professional composure, setting the medication cup on his bedside table with deliberate calmness. "Mr. Lawson, I need you to take your medication now," I said, using my firm nurse voice that usually worked with difficult patients. He tilted his head at that impossible angle again, further than seemed comfortable for a human neck. And when he replied, it was my firm nurse voice coming back at me, but layered somehow, like multiple recordings of my voice playing simultaneously at slightly different speeds. The sound made my teeth ache. His mouth stretched into an expression that wasn't quite a smile, more like someone who'd studied pictures of smiles but never understood the emotion behind them. I reached for the call button to alert security, a standard protocol for patients exhibiting aggressive or unusual behavior, but Robert moved faster than I'd seen him move before, his hand shooting out to grab my wrist. His grip felt wrong, too precise, each finger applying exactly the same pressure like he'd calculated the optimal force to hold without bruising. "Protocol for patients exhibiting aggressive or unusual behavior," he said in that horrible chorus of my own voice. And then he started laughing. Except it was my nervous laugh from earlier that day when Barbara had made a joke about the coffee machine being possessed. The sound of my own laugh coming from his throat, distorted and multiplied, made bile rise in my throat. I yanked my arm back hard enough to break his grip and stumbled backward toward the door, but he was already out of bed, moving in this jerky, stop-motion way that reminded me of a video buffering on slow internet. He began reciting everything I'd said since entering the room, but backwards, the words clear despite being in reverse order, creating these nonsensical sentences that somehow made perfect sense in their wrongness. When I screamed for help, he screamed too, matching my pitch and desperation so perfectly that anyone listening would think two women were being attacked. The door handle felt miles away as I fumbled for it behind my back, never taking my eyes off him as he advanced, still speaking in my voice, now mixing in conversations I'd had with other patients throughout the night. Finally, my fingers found the handle and I burst into the hallway, nearly colliding with Steve, the security guard who usually dozed at his desk until his rounds at 3 a.m. "Room 214 now," I gasped, pointing back at Robert's room. But when Steve rushed past me with his hand on his radio, Robert was back in his bed, lying perfectly still with his eyes closed, looking like any other sedated patient. Steve turned to me with that expression I knew too well, the one that said he thought I was overreacting to a difficult patient. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words tumbled out in a panic that made me sound hysterical. Steve checked Robert's vitals, which were completely normal, and found him unresponsive to verbal commands, apparently deep asleep. "The security footage would show everything," I insisted, dragging Steve to the monitor station where we kept recordings of all patient rooms. But when we pulled up the feed from Robert's room, the timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., the exact time I'd been in there. Yet the video showed me standing alone in the room, talking to a patient who appeared to be sleeping the entire time, never moving, never speaking, never grabbing my wrist. My incident report took 2 hours to write because I kept starting over, trying to find words that would make someone believe what I'd experienced. Barbara arrived early that morning after Steve called her, her owl eyes scrutinizing me as I sat in her office, still wearing my scrubs that smelled like fear sweat. She read my report 3 times, occasionally glancing up at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "These night shifts can be stressful," she finally said, sliding a different form across her desk, a request for voluntary psychological evaluation. When I refused to sign it, insisting we check other cameras or interview other patients who might have heard something, her face hardened. She pulled out her tablet and showed me an email she'd already drafted to HR about my concerning behavior and potential danger to patient welfare. The choice was clear: sign the evaluation request and take a mental health break, or face an official investigation that would likely end my nursing career before it had really begun. I signed the paper with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling, watching my carefully built professional reputation crumble over something I couldn't prove. 2 weeks into my mandatory leave, I couldn't stop thinking about that night, replaying every detail while sitting in my apartment in my pajamas at 3 p.m., surrounded by unopened emails from concerned coworkers. Jenna tried to be supportive, but I could see the doubt in her eyes when I told her the story, the way she'd change the subject or suggest maybe I really did need the rest. I started researching Robert Lawson obsessively, finding his social media profiles, his ex-wife's blog about their divorce, anything that might explain what had happened. Then I discovered something that made me slam my laptop shut. A post from his ex-wife dated 3 months before his admission, describing how he'd started mimicking her voice during arguments, repeating her words in what she called that demon voice, until she'd locked herself in the bathroom terrified. She'd tried to get a restraining order, but the judge dismissed it as marital disputes, especially since Robert's lawyer provided recordings that proved it was just her voice on the audio, no evidence of him speaking at all. She wrote about how the police thought she was having a breakdown, how her own family suggested she seek help for stress-related delusions. I drove to Clearwater against Barbara's explicit orders to stay away during my leave, parking across the street at 2 a.m., watching the windows of the psychiatric ward from my car. Robert had been discharged a week after the incident, his evaluation determining he was stable and posed no threat to himself or others. But I knew he'd be back. They always came back. 3 nights I sat there, drinking cold coffee and fighting sleep, until I saw him walking through the main entrance, not as a patient this time, but wearing civilian clothes, carrying a clipboard like he belonged there. My phone battery was at 12% when I started recording, zooming in as much as the camera would allow. He walked through the security doors using an ID badge, not forcing entry, not sneaking, just badging in like any employee. Through the windows, I could see him moving down the hallway toward the psychiatric ward. That same jerky, stuttering walk I remembered. I called 911, told them there was an intruder at Clearwater Medical Center, possibly dangerous. But when they transferred me to Clearwater's security, Steve answered, his tired voice assuring me that no unauthorized persons were in the building, that all staff members were accounted for, that perhaps I should rest and take care of myself. The video I'd recorded on my phone showed nothing but empty windows and dark hallways when I reviewed it later, though I knew what I'd seen. I sent it to Jenna anyway, desperate for someone to see something, anything that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. She called me back immediately, but not about the video. She'd just gotten off her shift at the restaurant and had run into Stephanie, another nurse from Clearwater's psychiatric ward. Stephanie had quit 3 days ago, no notice, just cleared out her locker and left. When Jenna asked why, Stephanie had gone pale and changed the subject, but mentioned something about patients not being who they seem, and how the administration was covering things up. I tried calling Stephanie 17 times that night, left voicemails that probably sounded unhinged, begging her to call me back, to tell me what she knew. She never responded, and when I drove to her apartment the next morning, her roommate said she'd moved back to Michigan to live with her parents, had seemed scared of something but wouldn't say what. The roommate looked at me standing there in my unwashed hair and wrinkled clothes, probably seeing exactly what everyone else saw, a burnt-out healthcare worker having a breakdown. I never went back to Clearwater, never formally resigned, just stopped answering their calls until the letters started arriving. first requesting my return, then warning about job abandonment, finally confirming my termination. I work at a veterinary clinic now, cleaning kennels and feeding animals that don't speak, don't mimic, don't make me question reality. Sometimes I still check the news for stories about Clearwater Medical Center, searching for reports of attacks or strange incidents, but there's never anything. Robert Lawson has no digital footprint anymore. His social media deleted, his ex-wife's blog gone, like he never existed except in my memories and nightmares. I found one thing, though, buried in a medical journal archive from 1987, a brief mention of a study at Clearwater about patients exhibiting elaborate mimicry behaviors that was shut down after ethical concerns, with all records sealed. The head researcher was a Dr. Morrison who died in 2001, but his assistant was listed as B. Crawford. Barbara's maiden name was Crawford. I stopped searching after that, stopped trying to make sense of it. Some doors, once opened, are better left alone, and some truths are too heavy to carry. But I know what happened that night was real as the scar on my wrist where Robert grabbed me, a scar that appeared 3 days after the incident, shaped like fingerprints. Though the video showed no one ever touched me at all,